At 8:30 a.m. on Friday, July 18, 2014, 41-year-old law school professor Dan Markle drove his two young sons to a preschool in an upscale neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. It was already a hot summer day, and it was only going to get hotter with temperatures set to go over 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the afternoon. So Dan decided to let the boys in on a surprise he'd been planning. He glanced back at his sons sitting in their car seats and said when he picked them up after school, they could go right to the pool and spend the rest of the day swimming. The boys got so excited, it sounded like Dan had just told them they were going to Disney World. Dan laughed and then drove a little further down the road, turned into the preschool parking lot, and parked his black Honda Accord. Then he stepped outside, helped his boys out of the car, and walked them both up to the door of the school where one of their teachers was waiting. Dan crouched down, gave each of the boys a hug, and told them he loved them and to have a great day. Once the boys were inside, Dan turned around and headed back to the parking lot and got into his car. Dan was average height with short brown hair and a beard, and he wore glasses. And today, he was dressed for the gym in a red t-shirt and black shorts. But before he went for his workout that morning, he knew there was a phone call he needed to make. So he grabbed his cell phone from the pocket of his shorts, pulled up his contact list on the screen, and stared at the name Wendy. Dan let out a long sigh, and his mind started to wander. Wendy Adelson was Dan's ex-wife. They had been divorced for a year and had been separated for almost 2 years, but there were still days when Dan couldn't believe the two of them were not together anymore. Dan and Wendy had met on a dating website 10 years earlier. At the time, Dan had been a law school professor at a university in Washington, D.C., and Wendy was a law student at the University of Miami in South Florida. And soon after they'd exchanged a few messages on the dating site, Wendy had decided she wanted to meet Dan face-to-face, so she hopped on a plane and flew to D.C., and the two of them hit it off in person just as much as they had online. Wendy was totally taken by Dan's incredible intelligence, and she could tell he was driven and that he had a bright career ahead of him. And right after Dan had met Wendy, he told a friend he felt like he'd won the lottery. Wendy was about 7 years younger than Dan, and she was beautiful with long curly brown hair and blue eyes. She had grown up wealthy, but never really talked about money. Instead, she just talked about how important her parents and her older brother Charlie were to her. And Dan loved that, because he thought family was the only thing more important than work or money. And Dan also loved that even though Wendy was studying to become a lawyer just like he was, she was a lot more fun and more of a free spirit than most of his colleagues in the legal profession were. Wendy had dreams of writing a novel, she had been a contestant on the TV game show The Weakest Link, and she'd even considered joining the circus at one point. And Dan felt like Wendy was a breath of fresh air in his relatively routine life. And by the time Wendy had flown back home to Florida a few days later, both of them were already convinced they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And so not long after that first meeting, Dan took a teaching position at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and Wendy joined him there when she finished law school. And then, just 8 months after they had first met, Dan and Wendy were engaged. Even now, sitting in his car in the preschool parking lot and staring at Wendy's name on his phone, Dan could still remember how stunning she had looked when she walked down the aisle in her white dress at their wedding, almost like she was glowing. And for a time back then, Dan couldn't believe how lucky he was to have a wife like Wendy and how great his life had turned out. And things had only gotten better when Wendy gave birth to their 2 sons a little over a year apart. And at least for a while, Wendy had seemed really happy too. She'd gotten a teaching job at Florida State, and she, Dan, and their boys would often drive almost 7 hours south to spend time with Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie, so Wendy still felt connected to her own family. But back in the car, Dan felt like his and Wendy's wedding, their first meeting in D.C., and his relationship with Wendy's family were all now ancient history. He was never quite sure why their marriage had actually fallen apart, but he was working hard now not to dwell on the past and to try to be happy in the present. Dan took a deep breath and finally called Wendy. He got her voicemail, so he left her a message reminding her he was leaving town soon for an academic conference, so they would need to work out their custody schedule with their boys. Dan and Wendy had joint custody of their kids, but they made accommodations for each other when one of them had to travel for work. Dan hung up and tossed his phone onto the passenger seat. Then he pulled his car out of the parking lot and drove off towards the gym, which was only a few minutes away. And as he looked out his windshield at the trees outside and the sun shining, he reminded himself that he had a fun day planned for him and his sons, and that even if his life was not perfect anymore, it was still pretty great. Dan worked out at the gym for over an hour that morning, and then he walked outside at about 10:45 a.m. He got into his car and drove off, and a few minutes later, he arrived in his neighborhood that was lined with large two-story homes with well-manicured lawns out front. Then, just before Dan pulled onto his street, he remembered he had to make another phone call. His oldest son was about to start taking piano lessons, and Dan had told Wendy that he would set everything up. So he grabbed his phone and he called the piano teacher. And the two men were still talking when Dan actually pulled into his driveway. Dan reached up and pushed the garage door opener that was clipped to his sun visor, waited for the door to open, and then pulled his car into the garage. Dan left the car running and the garage door open while he sat in his car and kept talking to the piano teacher. But then suddenly, Dan saw something move in his rearview mirror. He turned to look back and asked the piano teacher to hold on for a second, and then Dan saw someone walking towards his car. Dan turned and looked out the driver's side window to get a better look at this person, but before Dan could say anything, he heard a sound like a firecracker going off. Then Dan's ears started ringing, his vision blurred, and he fell forward against the steering wheel. At 10:50 a.m., about the time Dan had pulled his car into the garage, a married couple in their 70s were sitting on their living room couch in the house next door to Dan's. The couple had just gotten a new iPad, and they were spending a relaxing morning figuring out all of the features it had to offer. Then they heard the loud popping sound coming from the house next door. The man got off the couch and rushed over to the large bay window in the living room. He looked outside and saw a light-colored car peeling out of Dan's driveway. He looked at his wife and he said he wanted to see what was going on and that he was worried someone might have broken into Dan's house and just driven off. His wife told him to please be careful, and the man said he would be, and then he stepped outside. The sun was bright and he shielded his eyes to block the glare as he walked across his lawn towards Dan's driveway. And as he got closer, he heard the sound of a car running. And then when he looked into the garage, he saw Dan's black Honda Accord parked there. So this man figured he must have just misunderstood what had just happened. If Dan was parked in the garage, someone would not have been robbing his house, and the light-colored car might have just backfired and made the sound he had just heard. So the neighbor turned around, walked back to his house and into his living room, but instead of rejoining his wife on the couch, he went back to the window and stared out at Dan's driveway. He just wanted to wait and see Dan pull out of the garage or close the garage door, and that way he would be sure everything really was okay. But after a few minutes, the garage door was still open and Dan's car was still inside. The man leaned up against his window, squinted, and tried to see if there was any movement next door inside the house, but nothing was happening, and he started to get an uneasy feeling in his stomach. So he told his wife he was going to go back outside again to actually go check on Dan. This time, the neighbor moved quickly across his yard to Dan's driveway, and he could hear the car still running. He called out to Dan as he turned the corner, but nobody replied. Then he stepped into the garage, and immediately he stopped in his tracks. He felt broken glass crunch under his feet, and he knew something had to be wrong. The man rushed to Dan's driver's side window, and he gasped. Almost all of the glass in the window had shattered, and in the car, he saw Dan's body slumped over the wheel. The neighbor shouted Dan's name several times, but Dan didn't respond. So the man leaned in closer to the shattered window and he saw blood in Dan's hair and on his face, but he could see that Dan was still breathing. So the man turned around and ran back to his house as fast as he could. He threw the front door open, grabbed his phone in the living room, and he dialed 911. When the operator picked up, the man told him that they needed urgent help at the house next door. He said his neighbor was bleeding from his head, but he was still breathing. But for some reason, the operator asked the neighbor a bunch of questions about what specifically he had seen that had prompted him to call 911. The neighbor didn't understand what was happening. He just kept saying that his neighbor was slumped over in his car, there was blood in his hair and on his face, and they needed to help him right now. Finally, the operator said yes, they would send someone over. At that point, the neighbor hung up, ran back outside, and rushed over to Dan's garage again. He leaned into the shattered window and tried to talk to Dan. Dan didn't respond, but the neighbor could see Dan was still alive and breathing. The neighbor's hands were shaking and he kept looking out at the street. He didn't understand why it was taking so long for an ambulance to arrive. Then finally, over 15 minutes after he'd called 911, the neighbor heard a siren approaching. But when he walked out of the garage and looked down the street, he saw a police car, not an ambulance. The police car parked in front of the house, and as soon as the officer stepped out, the neighbor ran towards him and waved him to come into the garage. And when the police officer saw Dan slumped over in the car struggling to breathe, he didn't understand why he had been the one dispatched to the scene instead of an ambulance. So he called the station and said they needed an ambulance immediately, and then after that, the officer reached into Dan's car and shut off the engine. Then, finally, a few minutes later, an ambulance did arrive, and Dan was rushed off to the hospital. But as Dan's neighbor listened to the ambulance siren fade into the distance, he worried that the few minutes he'd waited before calling 911, and then all the confusion that had occurred with the emergency operator had cost Dan so much time and quite possibly his life. At around noon that day, less than an hour after the ambulance arrived at Dan's house, Detective Craig Issam of the Tallahassee Police drove through a wealthy neighborhood, and he saw kids who were off from school for the summer laughing and playing in their front yards. But as Issam turned onto Dan Street, the flashing lights from squad cars and the yellow crime scene tape around Dan's house painted a very different picture. He parked his car in the line of cop cars on the street, looked out the window, and saw several officers moving in and out of Dan's open garage. Issam knew some people thought bad things never happened in upscale neighborhoods like this one, but he'd been a cop for 25 years, and so he knew bad things could happen anywhere. Issam stepped out of the car and walked up Dan's driveway. He was a stocky man with short-cropped gray hair, and today he wore a black golf shirt tucked into khaki pants. Detective Issam took off his sunglasses and stepped into the garage, where the first officers who'd arrived at the scene were looking at Dan's parked car. There was glass all over the ground, and Issam saw the driver's side window was almost completely shattered, and when he looked in the car, he saw a broken pair of eyeglasses on the floorboard. All Issam knew about the scene was that Dan Markle, a well-respected law school professor, had been found slumped over in this car with bullet wounds in his head, and that he had been taken to the hospital. Issam talked briefly with the other officers on the scene, and he learned that when they had checked the house, there was no signs of struggle or forced entry. He also learned that the next-door neighbor was the one who had found Dan and called 911. So, while the officers continued to photograph the scene inside of the garage and dust Dan's car for fingerprints, Issam walked next door and found Dan's neighbor still standing outside. Issam smiled and told the man he'd just like to ask him some questions, and the man said he wanted to help in any way he could. Then, the man relayed his version of events from the time he'd heard the popping sound next door and gone to look out the window. And as Issam listened, one thing jumped out at him: the car the man had seen peeling out of the driveway. But this neighbor had not gotten a license plate number, and he could only say it looked like a pretty common car that was a light color. With that description, Issam knew finding the specific car might end up being impossible, but at least it was something to go on. Issam also learned from the neighbor that Dan had 2 young sons and an ex-wife named Wendy Adelson. Issam had no idea whether Wendy was connected to the car that had driven off from Dan's house, but in cases like this, the ex-spouse was almost always the first person to talk to. So Issam thanked the man for his help and then walked back to Dan's garage. By this point, police had gotten word from the hospital that Dan was not going to survive, and they would later learn that Dan had never regained consciousness at the hospital and he had died at around 1 p.m. Issam also found out that for some reason, the 911 operator had not made the call from Dan's neighbor a high-priority response. Issam didn't know if a faster emergency response would have saved Dan's life, but when he heard the news that Dan wasn't going to make it, his first thoughts were of Dan's sons. Dwelling on the 911 call wouldn't change the fact that 2 young boys would now have to grow up without their father, and that hit Issam very hard. And that news also made it very important for him to talk to Dan's ex-wife as soon as possible. Regardless of her potential involvement in what happened to Dan, she would still have to tell her sons that their father was now dead. So Issam walked back to his car, left the scene of the crime, and started looking for Wendy. At around 2:30 p.m., about 3.5 hours after the 911 call, Detective Issam pulled into the parking lot of a high-end shopping center. With the help of cell phone and GPS data, police had tracked Wendy down to a popular restaurant that was there. Issam got out of his car, walked into the restaurant, and scanned the tables. He spotted Wendy sitting with 2 other women. She was 35 years old, and she wore a dark blue t-shirt with a print on it and blue shorts. And she had her hair pulled up in a bun with her sunglasses perched on top. Issam stood there and watched Wendy for a few moments. She was talking with her friends and laughing, and so on the surface, she did not appear to have any idea about what had just happened to her ex-husband, but Issam knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. Some people were just really good at hiding things. So Issam made his way over to their table, and right away the three women stopped what they were doing and looked up at him. He smiled and said he was sorry to interrupt their lunch, but that he needed to speak to Wendy Adelson. Wendy immediately put her hand up and had a very confused look on her face. Then Issam showed her his badge and told her he needed to talk to her at the station about an incident that had occurred that morning. And the look of confusion on Wendy's face turned to fear, and she wanted to know if her children were all right. Issam assured her her children were fine, and then he asked her to come to the station again. Wendy looked at her friends nervously, and then she grabbed her purse and followed Detective Issam out of the restaurant. Once they were outside, Wendy climbed into Issam's car, and the two of them rode the 10 minutes to the police station in almost complete silence. When they arrived at the police station, another officer led Wendy into a small interrogation room where she took a seat at a wooden table. Even after being outside in the Florida sun, the light in the room seemed bright and glaring to Wendy. A few minutes later, Issam walked in carrying a small notebook and a pen. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Wendy at the table. Right away, Wendy wanted to know what was going on and why she'd been brought here. So Issam told her that earlier that morning, her ex-husband, Dan, had been shot and killed in his car while he was parked in the garage. Wendy immediately burst into tears and buried her face in her hands and kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." Then, at some point, Wendy looked up at Issam, and something in her eyes changed, like the lawyer in her had suddenly kicked in. She told the detective she understood why she was here, she was a suspect, but she said she had nothing to do with whatever happened to Dan. Issam told her he was just trying to get a better understanding of what might have happened, and Wendy nodded and then took a deep breath. Then Issam asked her where she had been that day before she went to the restaurant where he'd found her with her friends. She said she'd been at home in the morning, had gone to the liquor store to buy a gift for a housewarming party, and then she went right to the restaurant. Issam scribbled notes in his notebook, looked up at Wendy again, and asked her if there was anyone she could think of who would have wanted to hurt Dan. But Wendy shook her head. She said Dan could be a tough professor and difficult to get along with at work because he was a perfectionist, but she couldn't imagine any of his students or colleagues doing something like this. So Issam asked Wendy about their divorce, and she told him it had gotten pretty ugly at first, and that Dan had not been the easiest person to be married to. But then she told him that she and Dan had been really working hard to get along better for the sake of their sons. Then suddenly a look of panic came across Wendy's face. She remembered Dan was supposed to pick up the kids at school, and now they'd be left there alone. And when she mentioned her sons, she started crying again. Issam tried to comfort her and told her they would make sure the kids were okay, and he asked her if there were friends the police could call to make sure someone was at the school when the boys got out. Wendy took another deep breath, then grabbed her phone out of her pocket and scrolled through her contacts to get Issam a list of names and phone numbers. Issam said making sure the boys were taken care of was his top priority, so he got up from the table, crossed the room, and stepped out into the hall. And once he was out there, he asked an officer to call the list of Wendy's friends she had just given him to see if one of them could pick the boys up. And then Issam just waited and left Wendy alone in the interrogation room. During his time as a lead investigator, Issam had conducted his fair share of interrogations, and there were plenty of times he could pretty much immediately get a read on someone he was interrogating. Other times, though, people were just too hard to understand. And right now, he wasn't quite sure about Wendy. He believed she was grieving, and he believed her story about where she had been that morning, but he felt like she just wasn't telling him everything. He thought that could just be the lawyer in her, or maybe she was in shock, or maybe she really was hiding something. About 40 minutes went by, and Issam got word that officers had contacted one of Wendy's friends who said she'd pick the boys up at preschool. Issam thanked the officer and then headed back into the interrogation room, determined to get as much information from Wendy as possible. So, again, he took a seat across from Wendy and then told her which friend was going to get the boys, at which point Wendy breathed a huge sigh of relief and thanked him. Then Issam looked her in the eye and asked her if there was someone in hers or Dan's life that maybe she hadn't thought about who could possibly want to harm Dan. At first, Wendy kind of laughed and joked that during the divorce, some of her family probably wanted to punch Dan on more than one occasion, but that was just because they loved her. But then Wendy stopped laughing and she got a serious look on her face. She covered her mouth with her hand and her eyes went wide. Then she looked across the table at Issam, lowered her hand, and said something had just hit her. There was somebody she hadn't thought about who hated Dan. Her most recent ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse. Issam wrote Jeff's name down in his notebook, then he asked why Wendy thought Jeff might have a problem with Dan. And she said that she and Jeff had only been dating for a few months when Jeff started getting really jealous of any other man that she talked to. And she said Jeff couldn't stand Dan for that reason, and that Jeff had a bit of a temper. Then Issam asked what kind of car Jeff drove, and Wendy said a silver Nissan Sentra. Issam jotted that down in his notebook. A silver Nissan Sentra could fit the description of the car that Dan's neighbor had seen speeding away from the house. Issam thanked Wendy for all her help, and after 5 hours, her interview was finally over. Issam was a long way from ruling Wendy out as a suspect, but for right now, he really wanted to go talk to her ex-boyfriend, Jeff. After Detective Issam met with Wendy, police contacted her ex-boyfriend, Jeff, who was also a professor at Florida State. Jeff agreed to meet with police, and they arranged for him to come to the station on the afternoon of Monday, July 21st, which would be 3 days after Dan's murder. But on the morning of July 20th, so a day before Issam and his team would meet with Jeff, they walked into a local synagogue and stood at the back for Dan's memorial service. At the service, Issam was struck by the number of Dan's former students who spoke about how much Dan had helped them in school, and how his willingness to push them to always do better had helped them achieve more than they thought possible. But it was the end of the memorial service that would stick in Issam's mind for years to come. Dan's mom stood at the front of the synagogue and spoke about how much she loved her son, and how much he had meant to so many people, not only at Florida State, but to the Jewish community throughout Tallahassee. And then, through tears, she invited Wendy and the boys to come join her. Wendy, along with her boys, made her way to the front of the synagogue and listened to her former mother-in-law talk about how much Dan's children had meant to him. And while this happened, Detective Issam listened to people seated throughout the synagogue start to cry. Then he saw Wendy's mom stand up, cross in front of Wendy's dad and brother Charlie, and make her way to the very front as well. And there she promised Dan's mom, as one grandmother to another, that Dan's family would always have a place in Dan's sons' lives. Issam left the memorial service, and he was taken by how many people that single act of violence in Dan's garage had affected. And as he drove away, he was determined to find out who had pulled the trigger, and he hoped Wendy's ex-boyfriend would help him get closer to the truth. The next day, on the afternoon of July 21st, Jeff Lacasse sat behind a wooden table in an interrogation room just like the one Wendy had been in. Jeff was 42 years old, and he was thin, with brown hair and a beard. He wore a t-shirt and jeans, and he wore glasses. When Jeff had first arrived at the station, Detective Issam had been surprised by how much he looked just like Dan. Issam stayed outside of the room and watched on a camera feed as another investigator stepped into the interrogation room first and took a seat at the table across from Jeff. Even before the investigator started talking, Jeff started fidgeting in his chair and tapping his fingers on the table like he couldn't sit still. Then, the investigator asked Jeff if there was anything he could tell them about Dan and Wendy. Jeff smiled and said he could tell them a lot. Looking at the screen, Issam got the sense that he wasn't really watching an interview. He was watching a guy get everything off his chest he'd ever wanted to say about his ex-girlfriend. Without prompting, Jeff gave a very long monologue about his and Wendy's relationship and how he still loved her, even though he knew she didn't love him. He barely stopped to take a breath, and he used his hands to accentuate certain points in the story. Jeff admitted that he did not like Dan because, as Wendy's ex-husband, Dan was always going to be in their lives, and he complained that at Florida State, Dan was one of those professors who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and that totally rubbed Jeff the wrong way. But despite all that, Jeff said he would never do anything to Dan. The idea of shooting someone was completely foreign to him, and he said he had been in Tennessee on the day of the murder, and he could give police the names of a bunch of people who would vouch for him. But even after Jeff had offered a potential alibi, he kept talking, and as Issam continued to watch from outside the room, he couldn't believe how much Jeff was willing to say without even being asked. and at times, Issam couldn't tell if he was watching a man put on an act or if he was watching someone who just really had nothing to hide. But then, during a rant about how sometimes he felt like Wendy wasn't being completely honest with him, Jeff said something that stunned Issam and the investigator who was actually in the room. The investigator put up his hands and asked Jeff to stop talking for a second, and then asked Jeff to repeat what he had just said. Jeff laughed a little, caught his breath, and repeated himself. And when Issam heard what Jeff had to say again, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And what Jeff had said would make Issam look at the case in a completely different way than he had in the first few days of the investigation. And Issam's new approach to the case would eventually help police find that mysterious car that had peeled out of Dan's driveway, and that would lead them to who had killed Dan. Some elements of Dan Markle's murder are still under investigation and pending trial. But, based on interviews, evidence at the crime scene, and surveillance camera footage, this is a reconstruction of the police's leading theory about what happened to Dan on July 18, 2014. A little before 8:30 a.m. on July 18th, the killers sat in a light green Toyota Prius vehicle on the street a few houses down from Dan's house. They were calm, and each one knew their role. The driver would make sure they never lost sight of Dan, and the shooter, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a Smith & Wesson revolver in their hand, would pull the trigger when the time came. Then the killers watched as Dan's garage door opened, and they watched him pull out onto the street with his two sons in the back seat of the car. The driver waited a few seconds and then followed Dan. The driver wound his way through the neighborhood, keeping Dan in their sights without getting too close to his car, like a hunter stalking their prey. And when Dan pulled into a preschool parking lot, the driver found a spot on the street to park and wait. Finally, after Dan had walked the kids up to the school, gone back to his car, and made a phone call, the killers watched him drive back onto the road, and they followed him. They still didn't feel like they were in a hurry, and they never panicked. They knew what their goal was, and they would wait until the perfect moment arrived. So when Dan drove to the gym and went inside to work out, the driver just found a parking spot outside a few spaces away from Dan's car, and the killers waited again. While Dan was in the gym, the killers, sitting in the car, just talked and joked as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. And then, after they'd been sitting there for over half an hour, the driver backed out of the parking spot, drove around the lot, and found a new spot. The driver didn't want anyone who had seen the car while walking into the gym to see the car still there when they walked out. Then, after over an hour had passed since Dan had gone into the gym, the driver spotted Dan again, walking out of the gym and back to his car. And at this point, the killers felt like they were getting close. Their sense of anticipation was starting to grow. The killers followed as Dan drove out of the gym parking lot and back into his neighborhood. And as they approached Dan's street, the killers saw Dan make another phone call. Then, at about 10:50 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the killers had first started tailing him, Dan had arrived home and pulled his car into the garage. At this point, the killers pulled into the driveway and parked the Prius. Then the shooter opened the passenger door, stepped outside, and crossed in front of the Prius. They saw Dan glancing back at them from his own car, so they rushed into the garage before Dan could have a chance to close the door. Then the shooter walked within 2 feet of the driver's side window and saw Dan turning towards them, still holding his phone. So the killer took a breath, raised the gun, and fired. Glass from the window shattered, and the killer threw their arm up to protect their face. The .38 caliber bullet had struck Dan in the cheek and lodged in his ear canal. Dan's ears were ringing and blood ran down his face, but he could still move. So Dan raised his left arm in a desperate attempt to protect himself. But the shooter didn't waste any time. They fired again, and this time the bullet broke Dan's glasses and lodged deep in his skull. At this point, Dan slumped forward. The shooter ran out of the garage, back to the Prius, threw the passenger door open, jumped into the car, and shouted for the driver to go, go, go. The driver gunned the engine, peeled out of the driveway, and sped off down the street. Minutes later, the killers drove out of the neighborhood and onto a highway heading south towards Miami. And when they were far enough from the crime scene, the driver made a phone call to a woman in South Florida and told her everything had gone according to plan. And then that woman hung up her phone and told her boyfriend, Charlie Adelson, that the job was done. It would take Detective Issam, the Tallahassee police, and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation years to put all the puzzle pieces together, but they would come to believe that Wendy Adelson's brother, Charlie, had paid two hitmen roughly $100,000 to murder his sister's ex-husband. It would turn out that Wendy had no desire to share custody of the boys with Dan, and that she had even filed a motion with the court that would allow her to move with the boys 7 hours away to South Florida so she could be closer to her own family. But Dan had fought the motion, and the judge had ruled in his favor, and so Wendy was stuck in Tallahassee. As of now, police have never officially tied Wendy to Dan's murder, but her ex-boyfriend Jeff was key in turning their suspicions towards Wendy's brother Charlie. During his long-winded speech in the interrogation room, Jeff had said he didn't think Wendy would kill Dan, but he was almost sure Charlie would be up for it. That is what had stunned the investigator in the room with Jeff, as well as Issam, who was watching the interrogation via the camera outside. And it would turn out that when Jeff had gone to South Florida on a trip with Wendy to meet her family, Charlie had spent most of the time talking about how much he hated Dan, to the point that Jeff thought it was kind of bizarre and obsessive, and how Charlie also thought that Wendy should be allowed to live anywhere she wanted with her sons. And what had seemed even more bizarre was that Charlie had once made a joke to Wendy that he could just hire a hitman to kill Dan if he wanted to, and Charlie had implied he had enough money to basically do whatever he wanted and get away with it. And so Detective Issam started to think Dan's death might have been a murder for hire, and that Charlie had possibly arranged the murder from South Florida. So, with help from state law enforcement agencies, Issam had expanded the police search of surveillance footage to include cars that could possibly match the description Dan's neighbor had given and that had been driven up from South Florida into Tallahassee on the day of the murder. And surveillance footage from bus cameras, toll roads, and businesses led police to the light green Prius, which they were able to track from Miami all the way to the parking lot of Dan's gym as the Prius drove off and followed Dan home. The Prius turned out to be a rental car, and police traced it back to two men in Miami with criminal records. And one of those men would confess to the murder and make it known that he and his partner had a close connection to a woman who happened to be dating Wendy's brother, Charlie. The driver of the Prius was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. The man who pulled the trigger and killed Dan was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The woman who was dating Charlie and who was believed to have directly recruited the killers was sentenced to life in prison as well, and Wendy's brother, Charlie Adelson, is awaiting a trial that is set to begin in October of 2023. And again, Wendy has never been officially linked to the murder of her ex-husband. And despite the promises that had been made at Dan's memorial service, Wendy and her family kept Dan's parents from seeing their grandchildren for years. But Dan's parents fought in court just like they thought their son would have, and in June of 2022, the Markle Act was signed into law, and it now protects grandparents and grandchildren from being kept apart when certain tragic events take place. Kendall Mott kept his eyes locked on the road as he drove towards the home of his father, 58-year-old George Mott. It was 6 p.m. on March 26, 1986, and the sun was hanging low in the sky over Crown Point, which is a small country town in upstate New York. A few hours earlier, 32-year-old Kendall had received a phone call from his sister Kimberly. She had called their dad multiple times over the course of that day, but all she kept getting was his answering machine, so Kimberly was worried. Part of that worry came from the fact that their dad lived alone since he had divorced their mom a few years back. On top of that, his health was declining. George was an ex-smoker, and now he had some serious issues with his lungs. He used an oxygen mask, and he'd just recovered from a bout of pneumonia that had sent him to the hospital for a few days. Kimberly was afraid their dad might have fallen or passed out, or maybe even something worse. She knew it would be somewhat convenient for Kendall to stop by their dad's place on his way home from work, so she called him and begged him to go by and make sure their dad was okay. And of course, Kendall had said yes. But as Kendall drove through the woods down a lonely 2-lane road, he really wasn't too worried. He had visited with their dad at his house 2 days earlier. George was taking his medications and was in good spirits considering all the issues he'd been dealing with. Kendall was sure there was a reasonable explanation for why George wasn't answering his phone. Maybe George's friends picked him up and took him to a local diner called the Wagon Wheel, where Kendall knew they liked to hang out. If that was the case, then Kendall knew he wouldn't be gone for very long, and so Kendall planned to just wait inside the house until his dad came home, and then once he was back and he knew he was okay, Kendall would call Kimberly and everything would be fine. And regardless of if there was a problem or not with his dad, Kendall was happy to pop by because he was close with his dad. His dad used to be a firefighter, and he was very devoted to his profession. He spent long hours at the station away from the family, but since his retirement a few years ago, he was much more present in the lives of Kendall, Kimberly, and their children. And that really made Kendall happy. A few minutes later, Kendall pulled off the main road and began making his way down a long driveway that wound between tall maple trees. George lived in a tiny one-bedroom house in a sparsely populated area about 4 miles west of town. It was very peaceful and quiet and green out there. The nearest neighbor lived about a half-mile away. At the end of the driveway, Kendall parked his car a few feet away from his dad's house. He hopped out and then walked up to the front door. But as he got closer, he noticed that the windows near the front door looked a little bit different. They had a dark tint to them, kind of like the windows on a limousine. Kendall thought that was very strange, and he figured he would investigate once he got inside. And so Kendall got up to the front door and he knocked, but his dad didn't come to the door. And so Kendall reached down and tried the doorknob, and right away he felt two things. One, he felt the doorknob was already unlocked, and two, most importantly, he noticed the doorknob was hot to the touch. And immediately, a bolt of fear shot through Kendall, because a hot doorknob could mean there was a fire raging inside the house. And so Kendall immediately whipped open the door and looked inside, but there was no fire. In fact, the house was totally quiet and nearly pitch black. Kendall instinctively reached over and flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on in the house. Even worse, there was this thick, dark haze hanging in the air that was impossible to see through. It smelled a little like smoke, but it also had this strange, sweet odor to it that made it much more unsettling. Everything Kendall was experiencing just felt totally dangerous. Whatever was going on here, Kendall knew it had to be bad, especially given the fact that his dad had lung issues. Breathing in whatever was in the air could not be good for him. So Kendall stepped into the front living room and yelled out for his dad, but there was no reply. Kendall felt his way through the furniture in the living room towards the back of the house to the bedroom where his dad slept, but when he got there, again, he just couldn't see anything. Kendall was really starting to panic now. He was desperate to get his hands on a flashlight, but he didn't have one, and he didn't have one in his car, and so Kendall turned, sprinted outside, got into his car, and sped over to the house next door to see if the neighbor had a flashlight. Luckily, the neighbor was home, and they did have a flashlight, and so after explaining what was going on, the two of them raced back over to George's house with this flashlight. But when Kendall arrived back at his dad's front door, he stopped. He was holding out hope that his dad was not home, and that he was safe, and that whatever was going on inside of his house had nothing to do with his dad. But Kendall also realized that now that they had this flashlight, when the neighbor went in there and shined it around, he might reveal something totally horrible to Kendall. And suddenly Kendall, standing there right in front of the door, he just felt like he couldn't handle that. He couldn't go in and see whatever happened to his dad. So Kendall stayed outside as the neighbor clicked on his flashlight, pulled the collar of his t-shirt up over his nose and mouth, and stepped into the house. The next few minutes were agonizing for Kendall as he waited to hear what was hidden beneath the black haze inside his father's home. Finally, the neighbor emerged from the house, and from the grim expression on the man's face, Kendall could tell something horrible had happened. Within the next hour, the house was filled with inspectors from the local police and fire departments, and all of them were deeply confused by the scene laid out before them. It didn't take them long to determine that a fire had broken out inside of George's house, but the way the fire behaved just didn't make sense. As the inspectors stepped through the front door and into the living room, they could see that there was a layer of black soot covering everything. But nothing in the room was actually burnt. It was clear that it had gotten very hot inside of that house. Sitting on a table in the middle of the room were 3 pill bottles that had all melted together into one plastic clump. There was also a nail hammered into the wall, and hanging from it was the metal handle of a fly swatter. But the flat plastic square that actually swats the flies, that part had melted off. Inspectors found other plastic objects in the living room that were warped or liquefied, but there was plenty of other stuff inside the house that should have melted, but for some reason didn't. There was a plastic model of an old sailing vessel that sat on the coffee table not far from the fly swatter and pill bottles, but it looked as good as new. There was also a stack of cassette tapes that sat next to the stereo that looked unaltered and ready to be played. The right side of the living room opened out into a small kitchen. George had decorated the sides of the refrigerator with colorful wallpaper, and that paper showed 0 signs of burning. But inside the refrigerator was a totally different story. The butter was completely melted, along with the plastic butter dish. In the meat drawer was an unopened package of hot dogs, and they were all cooked. The inspectors struggled to comprehend what actually happened. How could a refrigerator turn into an oven on the inside, while the outside of it was totally unaffected by the heat? And things got even weirder as the inspectors moved to the back of the house to George's bedroom. As they stepped inside, inspectors could see the TV on George's wooden dresser was caved in on the top, where the plastic shell had melted down into itself. But the dresser it was sitting on was good as new, aside from the layer of soot that covered it. In the corner of the bedroom was George's oxygen machine. Not only was it undamaged by the heat, it was still running when the inspectors arrived. Resting on top of that machine was George's plastic oxygen mask. Unlike the television, the mask had not melted. This was made all the more strange because the mask and the machine were just inches from the bed, where clearly an intense fire had raged within the last day. Now the fire was out, leaving behind a scorched, tangled mess. The wooden bed frame was charred in places, but it was still standing up. The mattress, however, was totally destroyed. The stuffing was all burnt up, and the net of metal mattress springs were melted in a way that made them curve down into a V shape under the bed. You could actually see through those springs and underneath the bed, where a large hole had burned through the floorboards. But as the inspectors crouched down to take a closer look into that hole, they could see that something else had burned up in this strange fire. Tangled in the mattress springs was a man's foot, burned off near the ankle. Near the headboard was a charred fragment of a human skull. Beyond that, they found tiny piles of fine black ash in the wreckage of the bed, as well as in the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Those ashes, along with the foot and the skull fragment, were all that remained of Kendall's father, George Mott. Before he died, George was a pretty big, sturdy guy, weighing in over 180 pounds. What was left of him now weighed about 3 pounds, easily fitting inside a shoebox. The confusion amongst the inspectors only continued to grow after finding George. George wasn't just burned. He essentially had been cremated. Cremation is the process where a dead body is burned to ashes, and it requires an immensely hot fire that burns inside of a special oven. Yet somehow, here George was, reduced to ash by this bizarre fire that only affected small portions of the house. It just didn't add up. If the temperature in the bedroom was hot enough to cremate George, how on earth was the house even still standing? But there was yet another mystery hanging over the scene. How did a fire as powerful as this one get ignited in the first place? The inspectors checked the electrical outlets, they checked the gas lines that ran in the crawl space under George's bedroom, they completely dismantled the gas furnace that straddled the bedroom and the living room, and they could not find a single shred of physical evidence that might explain how George caught on fire. A few days later, the New York State police inspectors finally just gave up. They couldn't see any signs that foul play had occurred, So they filed a final report that simply stated that George's death was, quote, accidental. Then they closed the book on the case. But there was one inspector with the Essex County Fire Department who wasn't ready to give up so fast. That man's name was Tony Moret. Tony was 37 years old and had worked in the fire department since he was 16. He had known George Mott personally, they'd worked side by side as firemen, and Tony really liked George. So he was determined to find out what really happened to his friend. On top of all the weird anomalies they found at the scene of the fire, Tony was puzzled by one more thing. He knew George was obsessed with fire safety. Tony just couldn't believe that George would be careless enough to accidentally set himself on fire. But after hundreds of hours exploring every possibility for what could have happened to George, he was getting really frustrated. Tony knew a lot about the science of fire, but none of those scientific rules seemed to apply to what he was observing inside of George's house. Finally, one of Tony's colleagues gave him a tip about an organization down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that might be able to help. They were called Parascience International, and they specialized in the study of strange phenomena that couldn't be explained by traditional science. Tony was hesitant at first. When he thought of the paranormal, he thought of things like Bigfoot and UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. To him, any organization that believed in those sorts of things was an organization he couldn't really take seriously. But he was desperate to find out what happened to George, and his own investigation had reached a dead end, and so he didn't really have anything to lose by considering a different perspective, even if it was totally unorthodox. So, in April of 1986, a few weeks after George's ashes were discovered, Tony took a deep breath, then picked up the phone and made the call to Parascience International. When the phone rang 400 miles away in Harrisburg, it was answered by a man named Larry Arnold. Larry was a 37-year-old school bus driver during the day, but in his off time, he devoted many hours to this group of parascience experts. For the last 10 years, Larry had worked with them to investigate many strange and unusual events. But Larry's greatest passion was studying fire phenomena that defied explanation. So when Tony told Larry what he needed help with, Larry was immediately interested. Larry listened intently as Tony flooded him with details about the strange case of George Mott. The body reduced to fine ash, the lack of damage to things near the body, the inexplicable pattern of melting and burning throughout the house. The more Larry heard, the more intrigued he became. And so by the end of this call, Larry said he'd be happy to drive up to Crown Point, examine George's house, and see if he could make any sense of it. And a few weeks later, that's just what Larry did. When he arrived in Crown Point, he met with Tony at George's home. It had been over a month since the fire, but George's family was still in shock and were totally undecided about what to do with the house, so the inside really wasn't all that different from the way the inspectors first found it. As soon as he stepped through the door and into the living room, Larry noticed that the shelves and the tabletops all had a strange glaze on them. It wasn't just soot or ash that you could brush away with your hand. It was almost like baked on, like melted caramel. Right away, a picture began to form in Larry's mind of what could have happened the day George caught on fire. And so Larry headed straight to the back of the house and into George's bedroom. George's remains had been removed, but Larry could still see the area that had burned and how it hadn't spread beyond the bed and the hole in the floorboards. Larry, like every other inspector who had been inside of George's home, couldn't find anything nearby that could have possibly ignited the blaze, but to Larry Arnold, that actually wasn't the least bit surprising. Tony and the other investigators had never seen anything as confounding as this case, but Larry had. It was extremely rare, but in his research for Parascience International, Larry had uncovered about 200 recorded cases that were similar to George Mott's. For example, in the year 1725, a Parisian innkeeper found his wife had burned down to a pile of ashes in the middle of their kitchen floor. Nothing around her was damaged from this fire, not even the wooden cooking utensils that laid close to her charred remains. In 1951, a landlady visited one of the tenants of her apartment building in St. Petersburg, Florida. When she grabbed the doorknob, she found it hot to the touch, and when she opened the door, she found the tenant's body had been incinerated into ashes, except for her skull and one of her feet. Inches away from the body was a pile of newspapers that showed no signs of burning. Another example, in 1970, an 89-year-old widow was found burnt down into a pile of ashes in her home in Dublin, Ireland. The only recognizable remains were her 2 feet, which were burnt off near the ankles. She had a vase with plastic flowers sitting on a table in the center of the room. The flowers had melted into a puddle, but everything else in the room appeared to be more or less untouched. In nearly all of these similar cases, Larry noted the same common threads. There was often a strange, sweet smell reported, and a weird, ashy glaze that seemed to coat everything. There was very little damage to the space surrounding the burned remains, and there was no clear indication of what could have possibly ignited the blaze in the first place. For hundreds of years, scientists and scholars had been developing theories behind how these strange fire events could happen, and the only feasible explanation they could come up with was that these intense fires were actually ignited from inside the bodies of the victims. Back in the 1800s, many believed this was God's judgment delivered to those who led an immoral life. Some thought it could be a byproduct of alcoholism, with the excess alcohol increasing the body's flammability. As the decades passed, many other theories have also been put forward to explain how a human body that is 60% water could spontaneously ignite. Larry Arnold had his own theories. He knew the human body was full of electrical activity that pulsed through the brain, the nervous system, and through every heartbeat, so what if the electricity somehow got amplified? Could the body start an explosive electrical fire that burnt itself out from the inside? Could it burn fast enough and hot enough that it incinerated the victim without burning anything nearby? Whatever the cause, this strange and rare event eventually became so widely known that it got its own name: spontaneous human combustion. When Tony heard Larry's theory, he thought it sounded crazy, but he also thought it made more sense than any other explanation he'd heard for what happened to George. By the time Tony officially finished his own investigation into the death of George Mott, he concluded that the cause was spontaneous human combustion. But despite Tony's support of this theory, the official reports by police never changed for George Mott. His death is still listed as accidental, with no mention of spontaneous human combustion. While there are many believers in the theory, the vast majority of scientists dismiss spontaneous human combustion as pseudoscience that is unsupported by physical evidence. And the physical evidence in this case is still contradictory and confusing. But despite not fully understanding what happened, for instance, why the outside of George's refrigerator was untouched while the hot dogs inside were cooked through, Larry felt confident in his conclusion that George Mott was indeed a victim of spontaneous human combustion. According to the wishes of George's family, his ashes were sent to a crematorium, along with his foot and what was left of his skull. Then, after that second burning, George Mott was scattered at sea and finally laid to rest. Thank you for listening to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to come back next week because we put out a brand new mind-boggling medical mystery each week. In the early 1990s, a woman in her early 20s, named Krista Frater, was working as a manager inside of a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. Not long after she was hired there, the Boston Store would hire another employee to work at their Madison location. His name was Bart Halderson, and like Krista, he was in his early 20s, although he was 3 years younger than Krista, and he was hired to be a clerk. Bart and Krista didn't know each other before working at the same location, but their shifts often overlapped, and so in time they got to know each other, and they found they had a lot in common. They both had grown up roughly outside of Madison, Wisconsin. They both had graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they both shared a love of home design. Krista, who had majored in art history in college, was very passionate about interior home design. As for Bart, he was just one of those people who naturally could fix just about anything with his bare hands, and growing up, his favorite projects were anything to do with home repairs. Whether it was something super simple or super complex, he didn't care. He just found it incredibly satisfying to keep a home in immaculate condition. And so Bart and Krista bonded over their commonalities, and in time, their working friendship evolved into a full-fledged romance. And by 1994, they had left the Boston store, they had gotten married, and they had moved in together to their own apartment in DeForest, Wisconsin, which is not far from Madison. 2 years after that, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child into the world. It was a little boy who they named Mitchell. And as soon as Mitchell was born, Krista decided she wanted to stay home with the baby, and Bart was in full support, and so he went out and he got a great job as an accountant, which paid enough money to pay for the whole family. And 18 months after Mitchell was born, Bart and Krista welcomed their second and final child, another boy who they named Chandler. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had saved up just enough money that they could finally afford to buy a house of their own. And the house they finally settled on was just this very modest, small 2-story home in this very quiet little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor is not far from DeForest, where they had been renting an apartment. But this little house in Windsor was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their boys. Not only did it have enough space for the family, but because it was their own house, as soon as they moved in, Krista got to really lean in to her passion for interior design, and she got to design the entire layout of the house. And then she continued to take pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. As for Bart, he immediately began doing home repair project after home repair project. This house became his trophy, and he wanted to make sure his trophy was polished at all times. And it wasn't just the physical house that made this feel like their forever home. It was also their neighbors. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of the people that lived on their street, and they were all so friendly and welcoming. And then before long, the Haldersons were deeply invested in community activities like the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club, and they were donating their time and money to other charities. I mean, so quickly, the Halderson family just found where they belonged. And over the next 2+ decades, life for the Haldersons in this little home in Windsor remained perfect. Bart continued to move up the ladder at his accounting firm, and Krista continued to be a devoted mother and housekeeper. As for the kids, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly give them. And in that loving and supportive environment, they both thrived. By 2021, the older brother, Mitchell, who was 25 at the time, he had moved out and was living alone in an apartment, and he had graduated from college. He had landed an incredible IT job with a local, very successful company. He was engaged to be married, and he was about to buy his own house. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he was doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, but he had already accepted a full-time job with SpaceX that was set to start in Florida as soon as he graduated. And while he was in his final year of college, in between his studies, he worked part-time at a local insurance company to help pay rent to his parents, and he also volunteered the rest of his spare time with the Madison Police Department on their rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. But despite how well everything was going for Bart, for Krista, for Mitchell, for Chandler, their lives were about to take a serious turn for the worst. It all started in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was only weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida to start his job with SpaceX, fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. Now, he immediately picked himself up and tried to tell himself that he was okay, but over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented, and his legs started to feel numb. And so in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital. And unfortunately, when they scanned his brain and they checked him out, the doctors discovered he had a severe concussion from this fall, and he had a brain bleed that almost certainly would require surgery at some point down the road. Also, the numbness in his legs appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so suddenly, Chandler, who was so excited about this opportunity in Florida, is now back home in a neck brace with a cane to get around. And even with the cane, he can barely walk. And then adding insult to injury, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX because he couldn't travel to Florida to start the job. And so they filled it with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic, but this was a crushing blow. Everything he had worked for had just been taken away. And it was crushing for his family too. Seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, laying on the couch looking totally miserable and depressed all day was awful. But despite how bad Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on Chandler and his family was nothing compared to what happened next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin that was located in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about 3 hours drive to the north of their home in Windsor, and the cabin was situated inside of this rural forested area right near a big lake called White Lake, hence the name of the area. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s, and when Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time to go fishing, to go swimming, or just to relax. It was like their vacation home. But at some point, Chandler and Mitchell reached a certain age where they weren't that interested in going to the cabin anymore, and so as a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, there was this huge storm that rolled through the White Lake area, and after the storm had passed, some people who lived permanently in White Lake called Bart and Krista and told them, hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there was some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged from this storm. And so Bart and Krista, they're thinking, oh my goodness, we got to get up there as soon as we can and patch up that window and fix the rest of the cabin before another storm rolls through and totally ruins the cabin. And so Bart and Krista pull out their calendar and they see the next weekend coming up is the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America. It's when we celebrate our independence. And the way White Lake celebrates the 4th of July is with a big parade down Main Street and these amazing fireworks out over White Lake. And so Bart and Krista, they figure, you know what, let's just hold off and head up to our cabin in a couple of days to time it with the 4th of July weekend, and we can make the necessary repairs, and we can enjoy the festivities of the holiday and kind of have a mini vacation up there. And so that was all fine and good, but right before they left for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little weird. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before Bart and Krista are supposed to leave for this trip, they begin packing up their things. And since Chandler lives with them, he's at home, he sees them doing this, and at some point he kind of got up and hobbled over and tried to help them pack, but that was short-lived because his legs were so weak. And so he sat down and just kind of watched them pack. And what he saw is they were packing lots and lots of cash and silver bars into their luggage. Although this was kind of odd to Chandler, he decided not to say anything because he figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their cash and silver in the cabin like a keepsake, I don't know, but it's their business, it's not mine. And so Bart and Krista, they continue to pack up their things, and Chandler, because he can't go anywhere, just continues to kind of watch them pack. And at some point, Chandler asks his parents, so how are you getting up to White Lake? And his parents would say, oh, we're just getting a ride from our friends, another couple, they're driving us up. But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They basically just said, it's our friends. And so again, Chandler's sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but you know what? It's their business. I'm not going to ask about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. And so he just kind of let it go. And so at some point, Bart and Krista, they finish packing and they move all their luggage to the front of the house right near the front door. And then a little while later, they and Chandler would retreat to their rooms and they would go to sleep. The next morning, July 2nd, Friday, Chandler got up early, about 6 a.m. And when he got up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs, expecting to see his mom and dad having breakfast and, getting ready to leave because they certainly wouldn't have left without telling him. But he gets downstairs and the house is dark and totally empty, and all of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and put near the front door, they were all gone. And so Chandler's thinking, did my parents get up at like 5 a.m. and leave without telling me? And so he goes to the door and he looks out the window thinking, maybe they're out there waiting outside. But when he looked outside, his parents weren't out there, and sure enough, their cars were still in the driveway. And so Chandler was left to believe that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these friends were, and they did not feel the need to come tell me they were leaving. Now, this did leave Chandler a little bit shaken up. He just kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing and the fact that he didn't know who they were going with, and now this sudden departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be just fine. These are just kind of random anomalies, but they are not indicative of there being any issue here. And so Chandler found a way to just kind of push these concerns out of his mind, and he just went about his day. And so because his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay at his house with him for a couple of days. And so she comes over, and because Chandler can't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend just kind of lounging around and eating nice food and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an undertone that both of them noticed that something was wrong. Chandler had told his girlfriend about the strangeness of his parents' quick departure to White Lake, but he had said to her, I'm sure it's fine, and she basically said the same thing, that of course your parents are fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista had still not called or texted or checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anybody. They were just totally gone and silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phone, it didn't even ring. It just went straight to voicemail. But by late that day, Sunday, July 4th, when really concerns were starting to mount about what happened to Bart and Krista, Krista would text her son, Chandler. And what she basically said was, hey, we arrived in White Lake. It's packed here. The service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or Tuesday early. And so as soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text message, it was like all their worries were completely gone, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone. They didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anybody tried calling their cell phones, which now was Chandler, Catherine, and also Mitchell, who had been looped in on what's going on with his parents, whenever they tried calling them, Bart and Krista's phone didn't ring. It just went straight to voicemail. And then the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, so this was the day that Krista said they would be home by, they didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them. And again, they did not contact anyone. Additionally, on Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell, asking if they knew where Krista was. Krista had recently taken up a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that day, Tuesday the 6th, and she was scheduled to work on that previous Friday, which was the day Bart and Krista left for the lake, meaning she had left on this trip without telling anybody at work. And according to her boss, Krista was the type of person who, even if she was running a couple of minutes late, she would call ahead or text ahead and let people know. So for her to just completely not show up and tell no one was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could process this information, Bart's employer began calling them, asking the same things. Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him, and he didn't put in for time off. And so all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine and other family members are trying to call Bart and Krista. They're calling other people in White Lake to see if anybody knows where they are, but nobody does. And so finally, the next morning on Wednesday, July 7th, when still there was no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler goes to the police and he files a missing person report. And pretty much right away, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake and asked them to do a check on this cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there. And maybe they just had terrible service, or, maybe there was some sort of accident or something that happened. But when the White Lake police arrived at the Halderson cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was there. In fact, the cabin looked like it had not been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And interestingly, the police would also tell Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage done to this cabin. There were no broken windows or any sign, at least no obvious sign, of storm damage to this cabin. And so after this revelation, of course, Bart and Krista's family is like, wait a minute, who called them and told them to head up there to fix these obvious broken windows? Are those the same mystery friends that drove them up in the first place? I mean, what's going on here? Was this some sort of trap? Have they been set up? Are they okay? And so by the following day, Thursday, July 8th, when still there was no sign of Bart or Krista, and the police really didn't have any new leads to speak of, Chandler was desperate, and so he went to local media and he said, please run a story about my parents and get the word out there that they're missing and maybe someone knows something and they'll come forward. And so local media, they would do that. They would run this piece. And so while this media coverage is going on the 8th, Chandler would go back to his home and he would hobble door to door, asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house that might have picked up an angle of the street and so may have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they climbed into that mystery couple's car that took them up to White Lake. Chandler was hoping that if he got this footage, somebody would be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had that footage. But as it would turn out, it didn't matter, because on that day, the 8th, the police made a discovery that at first seemed relatively minor, relatively small, but when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge discovery and it completely broke the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to June 29th, 2021. So 3 days before Bart and Krista hopped into that mystery person's car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally just had it. There had been something bothering him for a really long time, and he had just finally decided, you know what, today I'm gonna get to the bottom of it. And so Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, he put it to his ear, and after a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered his call. In total, Bart and Omar would talk on the phone for a total of 17 minutes. And for the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being really angry and aggressive towards Omar. But then during the second half of the call, when Omar really had a chance to speak for the first time, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. And so after this 17-minute phone call finally comes to an end, Bart is left kind of in shock, but he knows he now needs to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needs to tell them what he just learned from Omar. And within 24 hours, Bart had set this additional high-stakes meeting with this other group. It was set for 3 p.m. on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this new pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home, and at some point he looked at his watch and he saw it was just after 2 p.m. And even though this meeting he was going to have was still an hour away, the location of the meeting was a bit of a drive away, and so he knew he needed to leave soon. And so Bart stopped working and he texted Chandler, who was in the house with him. He just said, ready to leave when you are. Chandler was aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in. And so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. And so after a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart have gotten dressed and ready for this meeting, and they met downstairs on the first floor. And after kind of a nod to each other, they begin walking towards the front door. But then something happens. Chandler was standing behind Bart, and so as they're moving towards the door, Chandler reaches out and grabs a rifle he was hiding on the first floor. He raises it and he fires at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then once his father fell to the ground and was either dead or dying, Chandler, calm as can be, pulled out his phone and he texted his mother and told her, hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me. And then Chandler also sent his mother a text saying, get soda on your way home. To which his mother just wrote, "'Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy as much time as possible to prep the house for his mother's return. And so over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, but it's assumed he moved his father's body into some hiding place, and then after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. And at 4:58 p.m., Krista would clock out of her job at the automotive shop. She would make a pit stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda, and then between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses would pick her up pulling into her driveway. And then just a couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home where she had raised her family over the past couple of decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her son the second she walked inside. It would turn out Chandler was living a double life. He had never graduated from college. He had gone to college, but for like a semester and flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and family that he was progressing through college and then he graduated from college, all made up. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department because 1, he was not a scuba diver, and 2, because the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June, but that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and then offered him a neck brace and told him, you don't need to wear it. That's only if you want to wear it. But then very quickly, Chandler turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering injury and literally hobbled all around with a neck brace and cane. And the reason he did that is he needed an excuse for why he wasn't starting his job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone in his life. And for the most part, people did believe him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious. Specifically, in 2021, he was telling them, oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company, but he never had any money. He could barely pay rent to his family, if at all. And so his dad would say to him, how is it you are employed but have no money? And the way Chandler would handle this is he would create fake email accounts pretending to be people in HR at this insurance company, and then acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails that had these ridiculous excuses for why Chandler had not been paid yet. And so he would have that fake email account email his real account, and then Chandler, in his actual email, would write back really angrily and sternly saying, you gotta fix this, my family's not happy. And then he would once again pretend to be the HR person who would say, I'm sorry, it's some issue that you can't affect. We're gonna fix it, but you gotta wait. And Chandler would take these exchanges and he would forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily totally believe what he was being shown, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other aspects of Chandler's life, like, for example, his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts, and he would tell them, oh, I can't access my transcripts. And so Bart and Krista are like, why? Can't you just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts at least? And the way Chandler would handle this was the same way he handled the insurance company. He would create fictitious email accounts of people that were college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have gone and graduated from, and he would do those phony back and forths where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours, but you just gotta wait. There's nothing else you can do. We can't get them for you right now. And when Chandler would send these exchanges to Bart would get totally worked up about it, and finally he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he can talk to one of these college advisors. And so Chandler went out and got a burner phone from a convenience store, and he gave that phone number to his dad, and then when his dad called this number up, somebody picked up, someone introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth, which really was just Chandler disguising his voice. And Daniel Spieth would give Bart the same spiel about how, oh, I'm so sorry, it's all the college's fault that we can't get your son's transcripts, you're just gonna have to wait. And so finally, on June 29th, 2021, Bart had just had it with his son. He was convinced his son was lying or there was something going on. There was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. And so Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College and pretend to be Chandler and see if he could get his transcripts. And so he dialed a number for customer service at Madison College, and after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service rep at Madison College, picked up. And initially, Bart was kind of aggressive and mean towards Omar for really no reason other than he was just so frustrated with this whole situation. And so he's on this call pretending to be Chandler, and he's kind of barking at Omar to give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me. But then after a couple of minutes, Omar finally was able to talk. And he said, hey, Chandler, I looked you up in the system and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to the school save for maybe one semester and you failed out. And so it's at this point when Bart hears this that he just pauses for a really long amount of time on this call, and then he begins asking follow-up questions that are not really connected to trying to get transcripts, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist because his son didn't go to school. And so he begins asking Omar, does Daniel Spieth still work there? And so Omar would look him up and he would say, no, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here, and there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here. And because Chandler had used like 5 or 6 different names when pretending to be college advisors for Madison College, Bart, in addition to asking about that Daniel Spieth guy, asked about every other name he had interacted with, believing he was talking to Madison College, and one by one, Omar told him, I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in the directory. I'm sorry. And so finally, at the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew his son was living a huge lie. And so he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called real college advisors at Madison College, and he set a meeting for July 1st at 3 p.m. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting, and Chandler was going to come with him, and they together were going to ask those college advisors why they can't produce Chandler's transcripts. Now, Bart, of course, knew Chandler did not have transcripts, and so he likely had set this meeting to get Chandler to call the meeting off and come clean about this big lie so that Bart could get his son back on the right track, stop lying, and live a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of this. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies and burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And then when he couldn't destroy their bodies completely, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town in parks and forests and rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while, as he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to police, to colleagues of Bart and Krista, that Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents, they were putting cash and silver bars in their luggage. So I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose the story he did. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that had maybe gotten them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just super gullible and had been taken advantage of by this mystery couple. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of his house, where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath sticks and branches, and so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th, when he walked into the police station and reported his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and was just saying things that didn't make sense, and he just totally came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone, and really just seemed like a guy who was hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th that broke the case open stemmed from the text message Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said, "My parents are missing," one of the first questions they had for him was, "Okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" And Chandler would tell them he got a text message from his mother, Krista, on Sunday, July 4th. And then he showed them the text message. And the text message said that they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed that this text message had been sent on July 4th, but in White Lake that year, the parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would be aware of, it's a small place, you're not going to miss this parade. The parade had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around in White Lake for the parade that had already happened? And so this led police to check phone records, and they would discover that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone, but when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside of the Halderson home, right near Chandler's phone. And so when police went to the Halderson house, they searched it and they found Krista's phone in the garage underneath a drawer inside of a shoe wrapped in tinfoil next to her driver's license. And so Chandler had obviously sent that text message on July 4th using his mother's phone to himself. But he had just gotten the date wrong of the parade. And so this discrepancy really opened up the floodgates, and before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone, meaning Catherine, his girlfriend, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anybody who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is in a deep sleep, glue a wig onto their head along with a beard-mustache combo, then decorate their bedroom to look like a hospital suite, and then violently wake them up and tell them that they've been in a medically induced coma for several years. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballin Foundation, and it honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click on